about the possibility of retracting published papers. What are the grounds for it? And
Oh, for retracting?
yeah, retracting
Okay.
published papers. Let's say you
right.
want to retract some paper was published 10 years ago.
Well,
What
so-
reasons do you have for doing that, and what's the procedure?
Okay, so the reasons for withdrawing a published article are variable, but you know, certainly something would be withdrawn if the conclusions are found to be incorrect. So, you know, we said we made this molecule, and upon further investigation, it turns out that it's actually this molecule.
I see.
Right. If the facts are incorrect, substantially incorrect, that really the entire publication is wrong, you know. Yes. And then there are so those are scientific reasons for withdrawal. Then there are ethical reasons. Scientific fraud, if the data was made up, if there was extensive plagiarism, if the data was stolen from someone else. Are there other reasons that, yeah. Oh, the procedure is via an addition correction, an erratum, and it goes through the editor-in-chief's office. So. Mm-hmm.
I looked at corrections in JAX from about 2000, I think it was 2005 to 2009, and there were, for all the articles that were published in JAX, it was about 1.4% of the articles had some sort of addition or correction associated with them.
Okay.
And then only a small percentage of those were actually retractions.
Yes.
I mean, I can't remember the percentage, but, and then I kind of categorized the different types of corrections that were there. And, but I would encourage folks to look at the corrections. They're now linked. If when you look at the record there in the ACS issues, there'll be a link to the correction, and I would encourage you to look at them because there may be, you know, we drew the structure wrong, or you know, the reactant amount was different, and so there's some valuable information in there. So I'd encourage you to click on that.
I have a brief question regarding the discipline actions to authors who are caught.
Yes.
Are they also banned from being second or fourth authors or whatever
Yes.
on the article?
This is a decision that's made by journals on an individual journal basis, but for JAX, yes, they can't be co-authors either.
So what happens if you find that you don't know that one of your colleagues who would serve as a secondary author on your paper, you didn't know that they were disciplined?
It's the responsibility of that author to let you know, hey, look, I can't submit to this journal because I'm banned until 2012 or whatever.
Okay. So it's their own
Thankfully,
personal
this doesn't
ethics.
happen very often. It's, you know, very few cases, but.
So in an ethical case, you're relying on their own personal ethics.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, so we.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
Right,
we
so-
track it.
I mean, the office tracks it, so it's not that many
Yeah,
people.
and a good one. I talk about submission letters of manuscripts, and a good way to make the editor life much more easier is that your letter starts. I am submitting this article representing all authors who have agreed to its contents. You know, that's almost something that you will have to sign eventually when you get down to this document that she was talking about. But just disclosing it up right means that you have gone through the effort of all the authors know what the paper is about, and they have agreed to submit. Don't submit papers without your co-authors agreeing by email or some, you know, verbal communication to the content, because you don't want to get, you know, you think they are your friends, maybe they aren't, you know, then you find out that you are no problem.
So I have a question about self-plagiarism from a PhD thesis, or even a thesis from another university in another country. It's not like an undergraduate thesis. First of all, regarding supporting information, are we free to use anything from a thesis there in an ACS journal? Or is that, maybe I should
you
backtrack
know,
one thing.
I don't want to give you a definite answer because I don't 100% know. So I can look into it and get back to you.
Yes.
One thing I can say is that supplementary information is a relatively modern beast from the internet days, and it's in flux. all right? Because not all of it is peer review. It's not clear what the rules are. So if you want to replace something in the supplementary information, so if you want to replace something in the body of the manuscript because you found a bug in your code and now you know the results are wrong, then you send an erratum. But if somehow that is in the supplementary material, it's not clear whether you are, obliged to retract it, to correct it, and, so I think it's pretty much in flux. I would, from my personal perspective, I will treat supplementary information as at the same level that you treat a paper. So then I would not allow for if the journal does not allow for copying and pasting from a thesis, then you shouldn't do it in the supplementary information. But that's not written in stone by any means.
On the plagiarism part of your question, I guess I could say that this is really in a state of flux at ACS. So the ACS editors-in-chief get together annually. There's talk about 5 or 6 journals going on to a pilot program there's increasingly sophisticated commercial programs to catch plagiarism. Many professors use stripped-down versions of these already in college environments. So anyway, there's going to be some pilot programs done. I view this as maybe a 1984 situation because as part of this, let's just take something we all know, like the 12 principles of green chemistry. These are in thousands of articles, almost verbatim. And the minute you start doing text comparison, you're going to have a lot of false hits. So I'm not personally wanting my journal to be at the vanguard of this because I see a lot of problems in the implementation. But the experiments will be conducted on automatically screening for plagiarism on the timescale of the next 2 to 3 years with a few ACS journals, and we'll see where that gets us. Okay, so that's a little peek as to what's coming down the line. What's going to be done about overlapping text is another question, but that's where I'd say the ACS is today on that important issue.
Good. Now, a somewhat more general question in this regard. What if we take a thesis and we describe essentially the same results and discussion, but in different words and with different figures? Is that considered legitimate?
No,
that's plagiarism.
Okay. So once a thesis is published, we can no longer publish a journal article that contains the same information as that.
I don't know, if you haven't published it with this.
No, someone else's thesis, but they'll be the first author.
Right. Right. So yes, once it's disclosed in the thesis, that's considered a publication. It's indexed by Chemical Abstract Services, and it's in the public domain. And so it's considered published.
Okay.
So there are ways, when I defended, I could restrict public availability of my thesis for 2 years to give us time to publish those things in a journal before the thesis was publicly available. So that would be an option. And then I want to briefly mention the flip side of this because I think this might be an issue for a lot of graduate students. If you do publish your work in an ACS journal and then go to write up your thesis, there are policies online that you can read, and the ACS permits you to use that publication in your thesis. So that, you don't have to rewrite that completely. That's not considered plagiarism. Those rights are granted to students in their dissertation.
All right, thank you.
Who had a question?
Well, I had a comment on that because I looked at the Journal of Organic Chemistry and prior publication policies, and there it says clearly that if you publish something on a thesis that is not available online, etc., then you can indeed submit it as an original publication without even having to, or I guess it'll be a good idea to disclose it to the editor, but you don't necessarily, you're not committing plagiarism.
Right. So 2 points of what you just said. If the thesis is not publicly available, then that is a different scenario. And again, we come back to the journal prior publication policies that do vary from journal to journal. So I would encourage you to go to that webpage and look at the ones for the journals that you would typically publish in, because there are definite differences. They're set by the editors.
I missed the beginning but if your thesis, if you're talking about something perhaps not a thesis but a term paper, something like that, if something is available subscription only, very restricted distribution, like an ACS journal, you can't put key phrases into Google. But say CNN or a lot of other magazines that are available, at least in part, to the general public, you can just type a phrase in on Google and you can see if, in fact, that was a previously published phrase. So you pick something unusual. And just 2 days ago, I got an email from a friend who's on the faculty at University of Chicago complaining about she was getting hostile letters to the editor in the University of Chicago newspaper because she routinely used Google to catch plagiarists. And, you know, University of Chicago is like Rice, a really darn good school. But apparently, plagiarism's really common. She catches several students plagiarizing in any given semester.
Yeah, and I think it also just speaks to the larger idea too of just, you know, the value of reviewers. Like, thank you. Even if a journal doesn't use these technologies to catch plagiarizers, reviewers have like really long memories. You know, there aren't huge pools of them. They're reading the same stuff for years and years, and they do realize, like, I think I've seen this figure somewhere before. Like, I think I might have read this somewhere before, and they do connect the dots. So even if we don't have machines sort of going through, you know, erring on the side of disclosure and asking questions just so that, you know, you don't make a silly mistake that kind of blacklists you, I think it's just generally the best policy on that.
So if you publish like 4 or 5 papers and in the end you are trying to write up your thesis. So in your thesis, if you add chapters from the paper, basically you're just taking up the paper and putting the chapters in. So will that be considered as plagiarism?
No, that's what I was just mentioning, that you know, you need to check with the different publishers if they're not all ACS. But for ACS publications, you are permitted to do that in your thesis.
There are just certain conditions, and you just make sure you read the conditions and make sure you meet them, that's all.
There are two sides to plagiarism. Plagiarism is copying something, but not disclosing that you're copying it. So if your thesis is, here is my thesis, which is 5 papers, you know, stapled together, that's fine. I mean, if your PhD advisor and the thesis committee thinks that that's fine, that's fine. You're just, you know, but you're disclosing that you published this.
So I had sort of a question. You talked about what happens if all authors are not consulted and don't agree, but what if an author is just left off and they're not told that they're left off of the paper? What recourse does that person have?
Yeah, that's definitely a tough issue that, you know, we unfortunately encounter very occasionally. That's not something that the journals can really address. You know, so if we find out about that, we would refer the authors back to, you know, so the Office of Research Integrity at the university. You know, they're probably not all called the same thing at every institution, but there are offices that deal with research and academic misconduct, and they would be the people to address that. And then once that group has rendered a recommendation or a decision, once they've made a determination, the journal will abide by whatever that is.
We have time for 2 more. John?
Okay. Yeah, the situation with regards to authorship, or in this case, inventorship, on U.S. patents is even more serious. If you work for a company, like, just say, this is Houston, so I'll use Royal Dutch Shell since they're one of my clients, and hopefully there's no one from Shell in the room. But anyway, if I were working for Shell and I said, hey, I think I've invented something, and I'm going to put old Joe on the patent because Joe is a really good guy, and that if that patent ever gets in trouble, ever gets challenged, you're going to have to disclose all your documentation, all the lab books, and if Joe really wasn't an inventor on the patent, then you have improper inventorship. If you don't step forward and say, hey, I'm going to change this because it's messed up, you will lose that patent. And I'm aware of a case of a former employer, because I got dragged into it, because I was left off a patent. So they had improper inventorship for that reason. And I had no idea, because I had quit the company and moved on. I never even knew that work was patented until I got hauled into court. And I got hauled into court because they have to disclose all the lab books. And it came out in searching the lab books that I conceived the invention and was the first one to reduce it to practice, namely run an experiment. And the company never bothered to fix it, so they ended up losing a patent that was about 9 years old and was a very lucrative business for them. So suddenly they had a competitor. And the whole business started because they sued the competitor for infringing their patent.
So yeah, I think these last couple questions kind of get to the same question of there are ethical violations, right? And then there's stuff that can like get you sued. So there's things you can do that'll get people to hate you, and there's things you can do to get people to be sued, and then there's things that'll do both, right? So obviously with the ethical things, like you do right by your group, and you leave someone off, that's, you know, is there some sort of legal recourse necessarily? Well, you have these offices of integrity on campuses and things like that, and hopefully that's where you go for that. But other things in terms of, you know, transmission of rights that happen in a journal publishing agreement, that's a legal document that you sign. So the implications there, or with a patent, for example, that's a very different sort of thing. So it's worth delineating the different buckets, but ultimately, you know, hopefully you're doing the right thing in every bucket.
I'm just wondering if there's any kind of guidelines or ethical basis on including in your references unpublished works, or say referencing personal communications or conversations. What advice can you give on that?
So, you know, it's important to properly cite things in your publications. If something is unpublished or a private communication, for my journal, at least for Jack's, we require the person who made that private communication to provide permission to cite that information. Does that make sense? So, you know, if I had a talk with John and he disclosed something that wasn't published yet, and I want to cite that information in my submission, he needs to send an email saying, it's okay with me that you cite that.
And don't you require an upload for some unpublished data too, or something, or upload for reviewer?
We do.
Yeah.
You do? Okay.
So
Yeah.
some journals require uploads of unpublished data, or some personal
Oh,
communication. So
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Manuscript of yours, which
Mhm.
is submitted to a different journal or being processed or wherever, we will not process the manuscript unless we get a PDF that we made available to the reviewers.
Yes.
So the reviewers have to have access to every citation these days.
Yes.
And private communication is being used less and less. And the few times that I've seen it, you know, I will also request a permission from whoever is being, you know, mentioned. But it's more to give credit rather than, you know, like, for example, you know, a typical case will be, I went to this conference and, you know, Professor XYZ said this, and that inspired me to do this work in this paper, something along those lines. But otherwise, you know, it has no real, in these days of internet and the way things are done, you know, saying, oh, I heard, you know, somebody told me something, and then I cite that as scientific evidence. Well, it's not.